welcome to Meet the Candidates. I'm here today with Emilie Kornheiser. Hello, Emily.
Hi, Jim.
Start us off. Tell us what you're running for, where, what party, etc.
So I am running for the Vermont House of Representatives for Windham 2-1. That's West Brattleboro and a small patch of Canal Street, really Route 5 as it hits Guilford.
Okay.
And I am the Democratic and Progressive nominee for that seat.
Democratic and Progressive, what does that mean? Does that mean two parties have endorsed you? Or
Two parties have nominated me to be on the ballot in November.
Okay, all right. So, and you've not been in the House before, is that correct?
Nope, this would be my first term.
Okay, so as you're getting ready to go to Montpelier, as they say, what would you say is your most passionate issue that you want to work with in the House?
So this is not as sexy as people might want. I didn't run on this one big cause around healthcare or institutional racism or all of the things that I think are incredibly important. I think many, many issues are very important, but I'm concerned that none of those things can happen, that we can't build the kind of strong, resilient communities we want unless we take a deep look at revenue in our state. And so I really, going to Montpelier, really excited and interested to break open a few of those conversations a little bit, to say we have a tax structure that's been patched together over many years. Many of our voters don't understand it, or are captivated by one piece of it, say property taxes. Mm-hmm. How can we think about this a little differently so that we can do all the things that we want to do, so that we're not always trapped in this particular size revenue box?
Okay, that's a really interesting start. And you're right, it is not sexy. As someone who spends most of my time doing finance, I know that most people glaze over when I talk about it. So we'll see we'll see. Maybe the viewers will have fallen asleep by the time we're done.
Maybe they'll catch us in the middle and we'll be interesting again by then.
So do you have some ideas about how to fix that? I mean, we do have very high taxes here. I lived in Massachusetts and I've lived in New York, and New York has high taxes like we do. But I lived in Utah where I paid, I don't know, I think there was a house that was worth $150,000 or $175,000, and I paid something like, $700 in taxes. Now, granted, it's Utah, but which it was beautiful.
So that granted, it's Utah thing, right?
Well, Utah is beautiful.
Utah is beautiful, and Vermont is beautiful. But when we think about, people talk a lot about affordability, but affordability isn't just your property taxes or the cost of your groceries. It's also your income. Mm-hmm. It's also all of the other things you spend money on, such as healthcare, such as schools, such as transportation, whatever else it is, that makes your life work. And I think many, many people, I know that many, many people in our community are saying, like, it's just not working anymore. So when we look at revenue and we look at taxes and we put all those things together, I want to say, what is it going to take to make it work for families? And that might be healthcare and childcare as a state-organized, state-sponsored activity. And that kind of thing would make other pieces of someone's pocketbook more affordable, such as property taxes. It would also create more of a virtuous cycle, they say. So sort of a positive cycle where more people are able to enter the workforce in our community, so more people are paying more income taxes, so that we do have more money flowing through. Mm-hmm.
So I recently actually was speaking to someone from Canada in a small group, and they were kind of talking about their taxes, and the subject came up, well, your taxes are higher than ours. But once healthcare and education costs got figured into that, there's total outspend, the total amount they had to spend to sort of live, to go to college, to have healthcare, was actually significantly cheaper. And I think that's just something that we don't really see here because
all we talk about is property taxes.
Well, that's a Vermont, I would say from a Vermont perspective, you're right.
And we don't talk about what are taxes for. And so I want that conversation. I want to raise up that conversation a little bit. What are taxes for? What is government for? And what do we want from that? And I think a lot of us want more than we're getting right now. I'm still going to be paying off my student loans when my son goes to college and he's 13. So what does that mean for my overall ability to participate
Right.
in the life of my community, the economic life of my community?
Right. Well, and also, healthcare, if one has a job that has healthcare coverage, people don't generally feel the healthcare expense. People that are freelancers that are used to paying out of their own pocket every month know that it's $500 a month, whereas a lot of people feel like it's whatever it is per month, it comes out of my paycheck, I don't really feel it. And that to me feels like a place where resistance comes in to adjusting healthcare policy.
Exactly. And part of it is because we haven't taken the time to have the robust conversations to really break apart that stuff. So I was at an event this last Saturday, and folks were talking about what it would mean to raise the minimum wage. And when we look at when we look at inflation over time, and we look at what the minimum wage meant to someone's sort of home accounts 20 years ago, that was before people were paying the levels of out-of-pocket costs for healthcare that we're paying for now. It was when a lot of other things weren't, childcare costs were much less expensive, for instance. So that what looked like sort of comparable dollars in minimum wage was buying a lot more for people in their lives. Life was easier a little bit in terms of what people were spending money on day to day.
Right. And do you know when inflation figures, because I know that when the government, the federal government does inflation figures, they don't include certain things like gas, which is volatile. Do you know if how healthcare or education are included in those numbers?
I don't, and that's the kind of thing I'm really looking forward to diving into over the next few months to get ready for my time in January.
Because the inflation rate technically has been low for years, but actually the cost of living has gone up significantly when you include healthcare and education.
And when we look at our public service costs, the costs, how our property taxes are affected by public school costs, so much by our municipal spending, by state government spending, so much of that sits with healthcare costs.
Right. So when you talk about you want to look at and improve revenue, are we talking about revenue for the state that then gets distributed to the populace in some way? What do you mean by that?
Well, revenue that gets held by the state and in some ways distributed by the state in terms of services, sometimes goes to town governments who are deeply underfunded right now, and sometimes goes to larger community groups to decide what's best to be done. We also have a huge network of state contractors that are doing work that have not seen an increase in their contracts in years and years, that are employing our neighbors that also have not seen raises for years and years.
Right. Okay.
And then we look at sort of the long-term costs around, prisons, substance use and abuse, all of those long-term costs that we know if we spend now, we'll save much more money later. But we don't necessarily have the revenue to be doing that proactive work in our communities.
Do you know, as I look at some of our neighbors that have lower tax rates, right? Because our taxes are very high, particularly property taxes, relative to our neighbors, forgetting about whether it's appropriate or not.
Not necessarily relative to other states that even have the quality of public education we have.
Say it again?
I think some states that have comparable public education systems to us have similar taxes. New York, for instance.
Okay. The neighbors that I'm thinking of that have a lower tax rate, particularly Massachusetts and New Hampshire, are the neighbors I'm thinking of, have a fair amount of big companies in their states that we don't have, which carry a lot of the tax burden. And do you have any thoughts on how we can sort of work with this revenue situation, given that we really don't have a significant number of big companies which often feed that revenue stream?
I think that points to an ongoing issue in Vermont and an ongoing solution in Vermont about how we can think differently about our economy. So we have, most Vermonters are employed by small businesses. We have a huge number of small businesses. And so when we think about economic policy in our state, are we thinking about economic policy that works for our neighbors, or are we thinking about economic policy that works for the small businesses that are here? So if we want to grow small businesses in order to grow revenues, maybe that means supporting things such as health insurance that support small businesses. Most small businesses will point to that as a huge amount of their costs, a huge challenge in hiring new people. What are the other places we can put in place to access to capital to accelerate small businesses? I mean, this is what you specialize in. So how are we adapting our economic structures and supports and regulations to think about small businesses rather than to just think about business as business as business? I don't know if I answered your question, though.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if you did either. I mean, so the thing that I see is different is we lack enough big companies to basically make up for the amount of revenue that can come in that helps lower things like property taxes. Okay, and that's kind of, and I don't know, I don't have a good answer, but you know, you're the person running, so the burden is on you.
It is, isn't it?
So you know, I don't know. Just trying to figure out if there's been some thought behind that piece of the pie, I guess is where I was going with that.
I'm sure there's been some thought about that piece of the pie. I have not done enough analysis of that pie to answer your question very well, and I'm looking forward to doing that. I know there's been some analysis of sort of where the money is in the state in terms of individuals that are, you know, high earners, folks with second homes here, what that means for our economy, areas that just aren't taxed as robustly as sort of similar areas.
So do you know statistically so I know statistically, you know, a huge amount of the wealth is in a very small slice, and then the next sort of large piece. So I don't know if it's the top 10% or the top 15% that have a vast majority of the wealth. Do you know if Vermont's numbers match the national numbers in that way?
Vermont's numbers don't quite match those numbers. We don't have that sort of 0.01%, which you would see nationally or in states such as New York, or even I think Minnesota and Wyoming actually have like an ultra-rich group. So we have, I think when we go down from there, we match up. We don't have that 0.01% that it's sort of the popular narrative around Occupy Wall Street.
Right. Like we don't have those the huge the 400 or 500 families that are that.
No, I think we have
probably even less than that actually.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
It's probably a couple.
But we do have, you know, we certainly have tremendous income disparity here.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So much of the revenue probably would, at least some of the revenue would have to come from that, and that's, I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. It's just where the money is. How does second homeowners play a role? I don't understand where, when we talk about the wealth of the populace of a state, where second homeowners fit in. Do they sort of count in those numbers or not? I don't understand.
That's something I'm really excited to understand. So what I do know is that when we count second homeowners, someone who owns a rental property, that property is counted exactly the same way as a vacation home would be counted. So those are both considered second homes.
Okay.
Which, from my perspective, as someone new to this process and looking forward to dive into the numbers, I'm not showing up here with a clear answer for you, Jim.
That's fine.
But it seems to me that those are very different tax categories and have different ability to shoulder a tax burden. You know, we know that folks who own rental property generally pass on the bulk of their costs to their renters because that's how that business model operates. Whereas someone with a second home that's sitting vacant for the majority of the months of the year clearly has the ability to pay more, but also are not using the level of state services that someone who has a rental property is. So those, it just seems like those are two different conversations, and right now they're considered part of the same statistic. So that's just an example of one of the things I want to understand better before I come back here next time and have this conversation with you again.
So what would success? So you said that I started this whole thing off with what's a project that you want to really dive into. So revenue was kind of the big picture. What would success look like if you were to go out and this is a huge thing, right? Revenue, you're not going to solve that in one term, right? I mean, go out a few terms. Let's assume that you're there for a few terms for the sake of this discussion. What would success look like if revenue was your project and this project was successful, whatever that is?
For me, that would mean that conversations in the legislature were sitting a little higher in the sky than they sit right now. Right now, very often conversations are captive to this idea that we don't even have close to enough money to do what we want to do. And so
we being the people of the state in
people
general.
of Vermont do not have that.
Yep.
And so every conversation is, if we do this, we can't do this. If we do this, we can't do this. When we know that often the true policy solution lies in doing the two things simultaneously. So we talked
Give me an
about
example.
we talked about the $15 minimum wage last year.
Yep.
One of the big challenges with the $15 minimum wage from many Democrats' perspective was that there were a number of parents, often single mothers, who were going to actually wind up financially slightly worse off because they were going to lose a certain number of benefits for childcare. So that was considered the benefits trough.
Yep. Okay.
And rather than saying, okay, we're going to pass a $15 minimum wage and we're going to do something about this benefits cliff, benefits trough issue that we've been talking about for decades, right? So that people can really ease their way and stand sure-footed as they possibly step out of complete personal scarcity. But we weren't able to have that conversation about, what if we just do both? What would that look like?
Right.
Because conversations wind up either or, even though the solution for communities, the solution for a robust economy, the solution for individuals often lies in doing two things simultaneously.
Okay, so let's go back to so that raises a couple things. Number one of the interesting things about living in Vermont is you have such a diversity of people that you can be speaking to. I've been to events, in Boston and New York, and one of the things that we're able to do here is I've told people, I've had in the same day conversations with people on food stamps about how they're living and what they're doing and what their problems are, and conversations with venture capitalists about the very same topics. And there's almost nowhere else, I've never been anywhere else in the world where you can have those kinds of conversations with that diversity of people. So it's a really interesting thing to do. But so let's go back to, what does success look like in this finance world? So we talked about the benefits trough, and what does that look like for you? I'm still not quite. You said have the conversations be at a higher level. Can you be more specific than that?
Yes. So one of my favorite things about the campaign leading up to the primary was that I was knocking on everyone's doors, knocked on every door that didn't have a no trespassing sign or no solicitor sign in the district. And it was amazing to me how even on one street in Brattleboro, there was people of such incredibly different cultural backgrounds, completely different economic backgrounds, completely different just sort of houses and prices of housing on the same block even. And I think that's amazing.
Right.
And I think it's an opportunity for us to truly understand how much each of our neighbors' prosperity is wrapped up in each other's prosperity. Because we're all, this is very idealistic, but I think we all can really believe that sort of everyone else is real people because we can know each other. It's a knowable community,
Right.
So getting a little more specific, I think what success looks like for me, it's an economy where the majority of people don't feel that every single day is a slog. Where, we have, I think most middle income families with kids right now feel like they are barely making it. There's, people do not have even the smallest cushion of a savings account. The only people who are able to buy houses are often people with family wealth from outside. It's an economy where people's paychecks can pay for their monthly expenses. I'm not even talking about, a lot of politicians talk about like people should be able to have pizza on a Friday and go to a movie. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about like lessening just the chronic stress that the majority of us are in right now.
Right. Okay.
And I think that by doing that, we will not just increase the prosperity of lower income and middle income folks, but that will increase the prosperity of everyone.
And the way you're going to address that is to be looking at entire revenue models of how we collect money, how we distribute services and money. So let me ask you something local. I know that one of the problems that we face in Brattleboro is, I think they say our town is 12,000 residents who sleep here at night, and during the day it can be as high as 30,000. And we essentially carry a lot of the burden of police, emergency services, et cetera, that are paid for by basically property taxes here in Brattleboro. So how, looking at sort of the revenue discussion you had, and one of the other problems is that, at least I've been told when I've gone to select board meetings and things like that, we are limited by state law as to ways that we can collect revenue. So can you use that as sort of a base for sort of what you're talking about around finances and how we might try to fix that problem?
Nice one. So I've just started having some conversations with people about this, and I'm looking forward to having more of them. What I've found and what I know is, one, if right now in Brattleboro specifically, and I think this is probably true in the other hub towns that we're talking about, nonprofits are a primary employer. That's one of the services that people come and access, whether that is an arts nonprofit or a social services nonprofit. And we know that they often don't pay taxes in their communities, but often choose to pay something in lieu of taxes. Our larger nonprofits do that. So if we can create enough prosperity in our nonprofit economy that, one, those nonprofits are paying higher wages so that people have more of an ability to either spend locally with rooms and meals taxes, or to pay higher property taxes. That's one way that we would increase prosperity in the town. We also know that if those nonprofits are thriving, they might actually be paying more in lieu of taxes. That's one example of what just sort of a trickle up economy would be. But then I think there's also some real separate policy solutions that we need to look at in terms of how we organize our towns, our counties, and our states. Because we do have a little bit of we're very driven of this narrative of local first, but we actually have very little local control. And so I don't know where the magic is there, but I think it's almost always important to make sure that our policy matches our practice, matches our narrative. So sometimes that means that we need to actually just re-examine our narrative and bring our narrative closer to conjunction with our policy and our practice. And sometimes it means shifting policy and practice. So maybe it means admitting that Vermont actually isn't a particularly local first state. And that being okay with us. But if it's not, then we should match our policy and practice and our taxation regime to match that.
So I don't think, do we have I'm not sure if we have county taxes in this state.
We do not.
Yeah, so New York has a very strong county system, and I'm pretty sure people pay county taxes. And a lot of that hub town problem, I'm not going to say it goes away, because it doesn't truly go away, but the sheer revenue stream of how to pay for these emergency services and libraries and things like that really gets leveled out with a strong, and I'm not saying a stronger county system.
And there's also a strong county government there.
Yes.
So,
I mean, here it seems to be the county taxes, or the county system is about courts.
It's courts and sheriff. Yeah, that's it. And so if that's a direction we would move in, I think there would be a lot of sort of internal reckoning around that, because when we even look at school consolidation of around Act 46 and what management of schools looks like when it's consolidated, not even actually consolidating the school buildings, but consolidating the administration of schools, it becomes an incredibly emotional, weighty, civic issue. And so how do we continue to have the level of community buy-in and community participation that we get if we're going to select board meetings, if we want to change the way we're actually making decisions?
And I think you hit on an interesting topic, and I know we're running out of time here, but our love of small it's a big part of the Vermont culture.
It is.
And it also produces some of, it's part of what, like everything else, right? The things we love are also create some of the things we hate, right? And when you talk about economics, and I mentioned not having larger companies, and we don't have a good system yet to really, like you said, scale companies. Like we can get companies, it seems, to 7 or 8, and I know plenty of people in Vermont that sort of perceive a 15-person, $1.4 million company to be a really big company. I think what most people don't realize is that's essentially a struggling mom and pop company. Most companies with 15 employees, whether it's your bakery down the road or the coffee shop, almost all of those are 3 months from closing. If something happens, that causes a little bit of stress in what appears to be a decent-sized private company employer in Vermont. Usually those companies are right on the edge, and I think a lot of people don't really realize that. And it causes for some tough times. So, any last thoughts before we close?
I'm really excited to come back and talk about all of this more once I've had a chance to dive deeper in. But I think what it comes down to is what I'm excited about doing in Montpelier, starting in January, and excited to talk more with our whole community about, is one, getting clear on what it means to right-size the things we're doing. So if we do have small businesses here, what does it mean to build all of the pieces that we need around a small business so that they're not, a hair's breadth away from closing? What does it mean to have HR capacity that supports multiple businesses at once, for instance? What does it mean to have a policy environment that supports that? If most of our decisions are made by small town governments, what does it mean to have a tax structure that supports that?
Right.
So, and if what we want for our communities is to have healthy, robust communities first, then what does it mean to have a revenue stream that will keep all of our citizens healthy? So I'm looking forward to having an opportunity to be in Montpelier, exploring those policy issues, and then coming back here and saying, okay, if this is really what we want, what does it look like to right-size that and have those conversations here with our community?
Right. Boy, it's interesting. If I'm hearing you correctly, really what we're talking about, even though you talked about revenue, but as it hit on business, education, local town government, really it's about changing our mental models and changing our own narrative.
That is my favorite thing to do, Jim.
Apparently, because even though you talked about revenue, that's really what you're talking. I mean,
Yeah.
none of those changes can happen. I mean, even what you had mentioned about supporting small business, the narrative I have primarily heard is about we need to grow. If we're going to do what we want to do, which is have families that are not sort of in a constant level of stress over just being a month from being homeless or 2 months. I don't think I've yet heard the narrative about, well, let's change the systems around all of us so that we don't have to say, okay, now we need to grow a bunch of businesses to be 4 times bigger than they are so that we can have all the benefits of that, because maybe we can change our narrative and change our entire economic structure so that we can have smaller businesses.
To support what is. Yeah.
To support what is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I look forward to that next conversation.
Me too.
All right.
Thanks.
How do the viewers find you on the web or wherever else out there?
EmilieKornheiser.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram.
You're everywhere. You're all over the place.
I walk down Main Street quite often. There are quite a few campaign events coming up, and people can learn about those on any of the 12 sites I just listed. And one of the great gifts of having the name Emilie Kornheiser is that I am the only person you will find when you Google Emilie Kornheiser. So
with a K, not a C.
with a K.
All right.
Kornheiser as a last name. Any Korn last name is always with a K.
Okay, good to know.
Yes.
All right. This has been Meet the Candidates. We will see you next time.